I thought I should begin probably by introducing myself. My first experience with the British military was just before the war. I was a Kuwait correspondent for the Telegraph and what was called a unilateral reporter seeking to break into Iraq and cover the war. I wasn't, initially at least, embedded, which became the modus operandi for so many journalists subsequently. I had really not had any experience of the military prior to coming to Kuwait, and not very much prior to finding myself in a white Land Cruiser driving around about a mile from the border, having tricked my way into the demilitarized zone. I had all my belongings packed into the Land Cruiser, some gallons of petrol on the roof, and courtesy of the Telegraph, a fake British uniform, which was how they had suggested I get into the demilitarized zone in the first place. It had worked to a certain extent, although I was then largely by myself. That was when I bumped into the Queen's Dragoon Guards A Company, who their lovely officer, Major Matthew Botsford, took me in. I had to sort of slightly mislead him as to my true purposes. I said I was looking for my unit, and he provided a home for me over the next 6 to 7 weeks. And I can remember actually Brigadier Bins coming to visit our unit just literally a few hours as night was falling before the assault was to begin, and he cast his eye over my as some of you may know, A squadron was the reconnaissance unit for the Desert Rats. So the thought of having a bright white Land Cruiser driven by an inexperienced rookie driver myself wasn't exactly part of the plan. But in the true spirit of the British military, they allowed me to follow Major Botsford into Iraq and play my part covering the war with them. That was my first experience of the British military, and entirely committed, entirely engaged, and really very thoughtful about the world that they were encountering in southern Iraq. It was a world I was to get to know very intimately. I lived 2.5 years largely in the red zone of Baghdad, as it was sometimes called, in a house with some other journalists. And I think the insights that myself and some of those other young officers had, the captains, the lieutenants, Major Botsford, about the nature of Iraqi society really held firm throughout my subsequent experience in Iraq. So fast forwarding to 2009 and reading about the large withdrawal of British forces under a sort of pall of, to some extent, ignominy, a sense that the military had been defeated. Certainly its reputation had taken a massive battering in Iraq. I really was perplexed as to what had gone wrong, given my experience with Major Botsford and all those positive attributes of the British military. So the book is really an attempt to get to the bottom of both essentially the conundrum of how so many young officers can do such great work in Iraq, and yet it could all go so badly wrong. The book ends in some ways with the Charge of the Knights, but I'll just describe in a little bit of detail the summer of 2007 when the British military's reputation in Iraq took its real battering, and it's a period that I report at great length in the book because it's quite crucial to understanding how the Americans perceive the British military now, and indeed some of the military's own difficulty in coming to terms with that period. Basically, Gordon Brown was presented with an extraordinary conundrum. He was considering a unilateral withdrawal from Basra Palace to all but a small little force in the airport, a move that one insider described to me as a Love Actually moment. That is, a moment that would be spun by Brown's team as standing up to the US military and trying to cover what would have been a sort of catastrophic departure from Basra. The other option, the one that we eventually went with, was to do a deal with a Shia insurgent leader called Ahmed al-Fatozi, with the idea that in his 2 years of captivity, a political process that had taken 30 years in Northern Ireland would somehow reveal itself through Fatozi's word and behavior. So that incredibly difficult situation over that summer really forms the sort of endpoint of the narrative and the downward trajectory of British fortunes. So rather briefly, I just want to sort of run through how we got there, hopefully as a way to sort of provoke some conversation and questions from you afterwards. Certainly, sort of hopefully they'll tally with your experiences. So how did we get to that summer and that difficult decision with the brand faced? It really begins in many ways, as many of us know, in Crawford, Texas, when Bush and Brown met on that fateful April day. Three conditions were set by the British as to for British engagement with Iraq. The one really noticeable absence was the question of planning. And it's been much agonized over and discussed why there wasn't adequate planning. Just to put it in a sort of bullet form, one reason was, of course, the issue of DFID. Blair's inner circle excluded Claire Shaw and her team for planning right up until March 2003, with frankly disastrous consequences. DFID was one of the few organizations in the British government that had some of the strategic and far-sighted thinking necessary to rebuild Basra. The other factor, of course, was DFID's own lack of interest, lack of belief in following the military into Iraq. So that was one nexus of concern. The other was a theme that I'll come back to at the end of the talk, because it's one of the sort of lessons learned, and that was the military's own desire to avoid costly reconstruction in Basra. The calculation was that by going in during the invasion, they would avoid having to commit to whatever UN reconstruction agency would eventually spring up. So the combination of those two flaws led to the extraordinary scene I describe in the book of Major Chris Parker, Chief of Staff of the Desert Rats, being given the sort of chief executive role of running Basra in April 2003. His only plan was a two-page document drawn up by one of the battle group commanders a few days beforehand. It was really just a PowerPoint presentation, no description of the infrastructure of Basra, no description of key personalities, tribal dynamics. Chris Parker did his best to work out how the city ran. But at a very poignant moment when Blair arrived, some of you will remember the scene, him in a white shirt against a background of some armored brigade tanks, announcing that everyone had done a brilliant job. Essentially, the war was won. What I was able to describe in the book is the scene that happened just before that Blair's speech, which was Parker confronting Blair, saying, and you know, this is one of those moments where a junior officer speaking truth to power, it happens quite rarely. So he said, "Where are the suits? Where are the reconstruction experts who are going to come in and take over from the military? We've reached the limits of what we can achieve in Basra." That answer was, of course, they're not coming anytime soon. DFID, Claire Short was out of the picture at that stage, but DFID still had to train through health and safety regulations the workers who would come out to manage some of the contracts. It wasn't actually until January 2004 that the whole DFID staff finally showed up, almost a year after the invasion. In place was a team of reservists who took over the civilian administration. This is often the role they play in war zones, in PRTs, where their civilian skills can be helpful. For a task as big as rebuilding southern Iraq, they were somewhat inadequate. There was a former banker who had become a ski bum, who became the finance minister, a former assistant director of Emmerdale, who became the culture minister. Well, there was a comical moment, of course, where as the heat built and the Iraqis began to rebel, these reservists, probably the most useful job was forming a riot line whenever they would come and bombard the British headquarters in central Basra with stones. So they would be grappling hand to hand with the Iraqis they were meant to be governing. So that slapstick scene, of course, disguised some of the more harsher, darker side to that summer, which was, of course, the treatment of detainees, which has been covered well by the Baha Musa inquiry. In the book, I trace some of the reasons for why Baha Musa, how it came about that he was beaten to death a couple of months later. It's a very dark story, and it's not one that is very edifying. There was a British colonel, the brigade army lawyer, Nicholas Mercer, who repeatedly came up with some good ideas to avoid abuse of detainees. He was also repeatedly ignored. Throughout the book, I try and highlight some of these sort of stray voices, and it's a real sort of testament both to the courage of individual officers speaking out against chains of command that are intent on ignoring them and ground reality. Well, anyway, that's Nicholas Mercer. I won't go too much into that subject. Hopefully, that will be something we can discuss in due course. The sum result of that disastrous summer was that some Brits had begun to question what could actually be achieved in Iraq. In Baghdad, Jeremy Greenstock, who became the ambassador, came up with a plan for quick elections to legitimize whatever body an Iraqi government and a fairly speedy withdrawal, recognizing the limits of what Western intervention could do in Basra. It's an interesting counterfactual to wonder what might have happened with quick elections over that summer. We, of course, know that instead the Americans opted to create a US-run administration with extraordinarily ambitious and foolhardy objectives of creating a market-based economy and liberal democracy. That spring was the uprising, which some of you may have taken part in, and really spelled the end of the illusion of Iraqi consent in the occupation. There should have been a moment, of course, for reflection in the British government. Instead, there was increased interest in ploughing into Afghanistan, and that was one thing I discovered in writing the book is how inexorably linked those two campaigns were. The hope, of course, would be, having learnt the lessons of Iraq, that they would be applied in Afghanistan. And indeed, a unit called the PCRU, which probably not many of you have heard of, it's called the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Unit. That was set up by Brigadier Nick Clisset as a way of planning across Whitehall, involving civilian and military thinking as well as creating a cadre of trained contractors, a sort of deployable unit of armored vehicles, satellite communications, with the aim that this unit would be able to fly in, make its recommendations, and if indeed a deployment was deemed necessary, they would then have the know-how and equipment to provide administration advice to locals. After an extraordinarily hard battle in Whitehall, the PCRU did finally deploy to Helmand. They recommended that, in actual fact, nothing was known about Helmand, and that far more research planning was necessary than had taken place. Essentially, they were ignored by Whitehall and by the military. This is where I found myself quite shocked in writing the book, partly by the attitude in which the military planners involved described their decision-making to me, and, of course, because of what they were describing. There was a sort of insouciant way in which they described Afghanistan as being a gift horse, which, if they turned down the opportunity to go into Afghanistan, they would turn down the opportunity for funding streams. And, it's in that sort of 60s way, there's that whole sort of dialogue about military-industrial complex governing American thinking. Unfortunately, a huge amount of military planning is predicated upon funding streams. These stem from reforms in the 90s, which sort of quite understandable reforms that led military officers being involved in some of the corporate side of the MOD. The result, unfortunately, has been that corporate thinking predominates. That's why, of course, a plan for 3 years, £1 billion, 3,500 men was pushed through Whitehall, not because that was what the deployment in Helmand needed, but that was what, as one planner said, the market would bear in Whitehall. That was as much as they could possibly get out of the system. That's a very edifying point to dwell upon. We all know what then happened. 16 Air Assault went in, the Taliban duly surfaced, and an extraordinarily large campaign began, which we're still fighting today, this time, though, of course, with 100,000 troops and the full weight of the US military. There was another calculation behind going into Helmand, which was, of course, that British troops could pull out of Iraq fairly quickly, and that was another assumption that proved wrong. In October 2005, a senior British officer, who all of you will know, flew to Basra after the Jamiat incident, in which 2 SAS soldiers had been taken hostage. It was a moment in which the collusion between Iranian-backed militia and the Iraqi police that so much money had been spent trying to build became apparent to all. It was certainly a moment to take stock and possibly reformulate a different strategy for Basra. In reports back to CDS at the time, it was the first description of strategic failure in southern Iraq. This was in the autumn 2005. Nothing was done, and the deployment to Afghanistan went ahead. That very much sets the scene for the summer of 2006, which Dannett described as being a close to breaking point, running red hot, war of 2 fronts, 1,000 miles apart, involving 2 brigade-sized forces that the military was barely able to cope with. It's in that context, of course, that Brown's decision seems to make a bit more sense, grim though the repercussions were for the British Army's reputation. The Charge of the Nights operation finally cleared out the militia out of Basra. That was largely down to the Iraqis themselves, although a British colonel called Richard Iron, who some of you may know, played a key role in seeding the idea with the Iraqis, very much against the wishes of the senior British military at the time. You can now say that Basra is a relatively stable, prospering society, although I think, as many Iraqis say to me, it's not because of the British, it's despite the British efforts in the south, which is another rather edifying comment. And it's interesting to think of the counterfactual again as to what might have happened without American and British involvement in Iraq in light of the Arab Spring. Would we be looking at a uprising led by Iraqis against Saddam Hussein, possibly with Iranian backing, making it more likely to success than perhaps the uprising in Syria at this time. So that's the arc of the story which I tell in the book. Let me just give you a couple of points on lessons learned and then hand it over to you. One essential point that is continually missed is that this idea of a quick war, that the campaign in Afghanistan can be governed on sort of 3-year cycles. It's especially true of Afghanistan because there's so much more governance capacity building that needs to take place. To think of training a cadre of Afghan bureaucrats in 3 years is completely wrong-headed. The political solution in Afghanistan, the one that everyone recognizes we need, is one that will take a generation. If this thinking had been in place in 2001, we would be halfway towards having a new generation of Afghan bureaucrats. Instead, there are still 2.7 million Afghan school kids in madrasas in northwestern Pakistan. Madrasas set up to create holy warriors during the Soviet occupation of the same region. That's where the fighters are coming from, and nothing has been done to tackle that problem. So the quick war is one issue that if you had looked at Afghanistan as a 20-year project, you would have set completely different strategic goals than you would if you were looking at it as a 3-year mission designed to tick certain short-term boxes. The other issue is discussed is the length of tours. 6-month tours have the advantage, of course, of helping families, military families, adjust to absence of their loved ones. They're not conducive to fighting difficult counterinsurgency campaigns. All of you who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan will have had experiences that can be possibly described in these terms. The beginning of the tour, the brigade commander tells his battle groups that everything is a bit of a mess in theatre of operations. He then lays out his plan for how things are going to get better. 6 months later, he reports, oh yes, things are a bit better. Next brigade commander comes in, recognizes all of the problems, says there's been a big mess, and then comes up with his own plan. These 6-month rotations have led to even shorter-term thinking than the sort of broader 3-year objectives that we seem to be using. There's also been a lack of knowledge built tour to tour, with the result that not until 2007 was there any real database being kept of tribal structures and insurgent leaders in Maysan province, for example. Each new battle group commander had to rediscover who he was fighting against and who he was meant to be helping. Every battle group commander in Maysan that I spoke to was going on raids and missions in which, at best, he would have a picture of the person he was looking for. Often he would be looking for, in one case, the blind beggar Mohammed was one battle group objective on one raid that led to multiple arrests of people, all of whom were subsequently released. A lot of bad blood created in the neighborhood. So 6-month tour rotations do not lead to effective counterinsurgency campaigns. And the final point I would like to raise is one that I was perhaps most shocked to discover, especially given my experience of A Squadron QDG at the very start of the war, and that was the failure to engage intellectually with the challenges of Iraq. It's particularly salient, obviously, to raise this in a Shrivenham at the Defense Academy. The Americans, as we know, had Petraeus to throw up his hands and say, we got it wrong in Iraq. It's time to learn and do things better. And all of you will probably have now read the field manual, counterinsurgency doctrine, and it's all part of everyone's lifeblood. At no point has a similar process happened in the British military. There was an attempt in January 2010 at Warminster to sort of have a lessons learned progress, but that degenerated into arguments and almost fisticuffs in the men's toilet, trying to argue whether the deal with Fartosi was the right action or not. The broader point is that there is not enough interest in understanding how Iraqi society and how Afghan society works. All of you who have deployed in Kabul or Baghdad will know that 90% of the time is actually really spent talking about the organizations that you're working for, about how they are getting on, how they're being protected, funding projects through, reporting back to London. And in actual fact, only a tiny amount of time is spent really engaging with the desires and interests of the Iraqis. And the final anecdote I will give you was a comment given to me by Richard Iron. He's described, he was the mentor to General Mohan in 2007 in the aftermath of the deal with Fartosi. And he had come out expecting to have to teach Mohan how a British headquarters worked, how to staff correctly the headquarters, how to teach them how the Brits worked. What he quickly discovered was that the education wasn't for Mohan, it was for himself. What he actually had to understand was how Mohan ran his headquarters, how Mohan operated, all of his web of contacts, connections, and it was only then that he was actually able to come up with a plan and a way of pitching it to Maliki and Petraeus that led to the Charge of the Nights operation. In short, he had to see the world through Iraqi eyes, which is not an easy thing. So anyway, on that, at the end of that note, a call for a new intellectual campaign. I give the floor over to you lot to hear your questions. Thank you very much. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think I have a quote in the prologue from Lawrence Friedman discussing the fallacy in some ways of thinking of some wars as a war of choice and others of necessity, because it distracts from the quality of decision-making for all wars. That is certainly true for Iraq. I call it's a slightly, there's a degree of irony, therefore, in the title. We have to focus, of course, on the leadership of Blair. We wouldn't be in Iraq but for Blair's insistence. He was obviously primarily concerned about US relations and placing Britain at the sort of strategic heart of American decision-making. Among his many failures in terms of management of the war was the failure to therefore think that what that means through, and that what that means using Britain's role as a sort of in the most strategic way possible is to have British officers